What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
I will start with the part everyone keeps asking about, the one sentence that makes people lean in and stop stirring their mugs, because it sounds like gossip, but it is really the center of my life, which is this. At Christmas dinner, my dad stood up with that proud smile he saves for other people's cameras and gave a long speech about my brother being the best thing our family ever produced, and then sat down without saying my name once. And I did not cry or argue or leave the table like the version of me they are used to. I just helped pour the coffee, stacked the plates, nodded at everything my mother said about pies and traditions, and then went home and did the first thing I had been waiting to do for years. If you and I were sitting together right now, I would tell you I have spent a lot of holidays training myself not to flinch, because you can either beg your parents to see you and feel that cold space open in your chest when they do not, or you can go still and hold the line until the moment is over, and that night I chose stillness, because walking out or making a scene would have handed them exactly what they expect from me, and I am done being predictable, especially in a house where predictability has been the leash around my neck for as long as I can remember. Dad did his whole routine, the one where he talks about hard work and leadership and carrying the family name as if it were a trophy that must be kept polished on a high shelf. And he kept saying my brother's name with that tone he uses when he wants other men to respect him through association, and it was almost funny, the way my mother's eyes ping-ponged between them like she was trying to keep the applause going with just her face. And I let myself smile because when you finally understand your family as a machine, you stop taking the gears personally and you start listening for the sound it makes right before it jams. Helping with the coffee was intentional because it kept me moving and stopped anyone from reading my face too closely, and it let me stay in the room without being pulled into the fake warmth that follows a speech like that. The part where they either pretend they forgot to say my name or they toss me a crumb of praise that lands like a tip on the table after a long shift, and I was not interested in crumbs, not anymore. Not after too many years of being told I was smart, but not the right kind of smart, reliable but not impressive, helpful but not headline material, basically a support beam nobody notices until the ceiling falls. My brother was gracious in that way. He learned from being constantly affirmed, because when you are praised that much you start to treat kindness like a public service, and he hugged me on his way out and said something neutral about seeing me soon. And I matched his tone because it was not his night I was thinking about, it was mine, and I am not going to lie to you. The moment the front door shut and the house went quiet, I felt that old ache press against my ribs, the one that says you could try again, you could explain what it is like to be erased by your own father, but I have explained it enough, and I have cried enough, and what I needed now was not understanding, it was leverage. When I got home, I took off my shoes, put my phone on the counter, and opened the folder I have kept for a long time, the one that is boring to anyone who is not me, full of little things that never mattered on their own but form a pattern when you line them up. Emails where Dad compared my work to a hobby, messages where he used me as an example of what not to do in front of people he was trying to impress, casual lines that sound harmless if you do not know the context but look different when you hold them next to the dates of his speeches and photo ops and all the times he performed fatherhood like it was a role with a costume. And I am telling you this because people think revenge looks like rage when most of the time it looks like patience. I typed exactly one sentence to exactly one person, and before you ask who it was, just know it was someone who had asked me in the past if certain things about my dad were true, someone who had a reason to care now. And I did not rant or accuse or attach a manifesto. I simply forwarded something that would make them ask the next question without me in the room. And then I locked my phone and made tea and tried to breathe past that humming in my chest that felt like a car idling in the driveway. Because once you put the first piece in motion, you do not yank it back. You let it go and you sit with yourself and you remember why you started. There is a thing that happens when you finally stop trying to win a rigged game, and maybe you know this. Maybe you had a boss or a parent who made you jump for approval that never landed. And the second you put your energy somewhere else, you feel ridiculous and free at the same time, and that is where I was when my phone lit up with my brother's name and a message that said Dad is shaken and will not talk. What happened? And I stared at it for a long time because it was not triumph I felt. First, it was relief. Not the soft kind, the kind that shows up like a hard truth and says you are right, you are not crazy. There are consequences when someone builds their whole identity on being untouchable and you quietly prove they are not. I did not answer him right away because I needed the pause, not to be dramatic, but to choose the version of me that was not sloppy with pain, and when I finally wrote back I kept it simple and kind because I am not trying to burn my brother, at least not yet. And I said I am sure he will talk when he calms down, and I left it there, even though I could feel the next move forming, calm and sure, the way a plan feels when you have carried it in your pocket for years, and it has molded to your hand. If you are wondering what exactly I sent and to whom, I will tell you when it matters, because the point of that night was not the document or the name on the email, it was the shift. The moment I stopped asking to be included and started acting like someone who does not need an invitation, and that is why when my brother texted again, saying he had never seen Dad like this, I put my phone face down and slept like I had not in a long time. Not light and jumpy, but anchored, because the first piece was on the board and I was finally playing my game, not theirs, and tomorrow I would decide whether to move the next piece or let him sweat a little longer. If I am being honest, the part that kept me quiet all those years was not just the favoritism, or the corny speeches, or the way my mother pretended the room was warmer than it really was. It was the sinking feeling that I was always auditioning for a role that had already been given to someone else, and that the callback emails would never arrive no matter how good I was. And when you live like that for long enough, you start editing yourself in real time, trimming anything that might look like need, smiling through comments that scrape your ribs from the inside, and calling it maturity because the other word would be humiliation. So after Christmas, I promised myself I would not audition anymore. I would not ask. I would not wait for a moment that required me to be smaller, and if there was going to be a reckoning, it would be careful and quiet and shaped like accountability, not a tantrum anyone could dismiss. I have to tell you how we got here without turning it into therapy, because I am not interested in pity and I am not trying to sell a tragic childhood. I am trying to show you the pattern the way you show someone a stain under good light, so they can stop pretending they do not see it, and the pattern is simple. My dad, Robert, has always loved the idea of us more than the truth of us. He is a man who treats reputation like a retirement account. Add a little every month. Never miss a deposit. Tell everyone about compound interest and pretend that the line never dips, and my mother, Elaine, is the customer service department of that brand, soothing, apologizing, redirecting, while my brother, Mark, learned early that it is easier to play the role than test the script, so he played it well, and he kept getting better parts, and none of that makes him evil. It just means he understood the house rules, and I did not accept them. And that has been the real conflict all along. I did not invent the leverage I have now, I earned it the slow way, by doing the kind of work nobody applauds because there are no balloons attached, work where you have to be exact and trace things to their source. Work where dates matter and signatures matter and the story has to match the records. So when my dad began bragging about a veteran scholarship fund he helped steer and a mentorship program he co-hosts with a church friend, I listened the way you watch a familiar street for a new pothole, and over time I noticed little misalignments, nothing dramatic, just the kind of sloppiness that creeps in when someone thinks they are uncheckable, like acknowledgement lists that added donors who had not cleared the background paperwork, and emails that turned donations into in-kind services on paper because it looked tidier that way, and a board minute that praised a sponsor whose check date did not belong to the quarter it was reported in, and none of it screamed crime to me. It screamed carelessness and image management and a dangerous belief that details are chores for other people. So when Mark texted after Christmas and said Dad is shaken and will not talk and what happened, I sat with it the way you sit with a hot plate you do not rush to touch, because the instinct to explain is strong and the temptation to take credit is louder. But neither of those serve the outcome I want, which is not an explosion, but a slow recalibration where the people who hand out the praise start noticing the cost of their choices, and the cost only becomes real when other people see the receipt. So instead of telling my brother the truth, I told him a softer version, that Dad probably got spooked by something he could not spin, and that the best thing we could do was let him breathe. And Mark thanked me for being level-headed the way he always does when he wants me to keep being the family shock absorber, and I said of course, because I needed him calm and curious, not defensive and loyal. Meanwhile, I opened a draft to the treasurer of the scholarship fund, a woman named Denise who once told me in a hallway that she admired how I handled myself when a vendor blamed me for their late paperwork, and I produced the email trail without raising my voice. And I wrote to her like a person who respects the work, not like a daughter with an axe, and I said that I was organizing my year-end files and noticed a small discrepancy between the public donor list and a thank you I received last spring for a volunteer training I provided, and I attached the note with the date and asked if she could confirm how in-kind contributions were being recorded this cycle, because I wanted my records to match theirs. And I copied exactly 2 people who would recognize my name and who would know that I do not write unless I am certain, one being a compliance officer I worked with on a totally separate project who believes in policies the way gardeners believe in rain, and the other being a pastor's assistant who has quietly cleaned up messes for years and has a very low tolerance for being made to do it twice. What I did not do, and this matters, is accuse my father of anything in that email. I did not even mention him, because I am not the point. He is not the point. The point is the discrepancy. The point is the policy. The point is that once a question like that lands on a desk, the adults in the room have to either reconcile it or document why they will not, and both outcomes generate a paper trail that is not mine to hide. And if my father happens to be a man who values standing ovations over footnotes, then a pile of footnotes can be louder than a room full of claps, and that is what I set in motion with 1 careful paragraph and 2 attachments that speak for themselves. I did one more thing that night that I have never done before, and I am not proud of how satisfying it felt, but I am not going to pretend otherwise, because the truth is what keeps me steady. I opened a message to my mother, and I wrote a kind, short note saying that I hoped she got some rest, and that the pies were good, and that I appreciated the effort she puts into keeping everyone comfortable. And then I added a single line that I knew would land like a pebble in a still bowl. I told her that sometimes comfort is another word for silence, and that I was done confusing the two, and I left it there without an exclamation point or a smiley face or a plea for recognition, because it was not a bit, it was notice. By morning, which in our family means the hour when my father usually sends his first volley of articles for people to read in order to stay informed, there was no link. There was instead a calendar invite forwarded from a board member's assistant for an emergency governance call about donor acknowledgement and reporting clarity, which is the bureaucratic way of saying someone asked a question that cannot be handled with a thank you note, and my phone began buzzing with my mother's name and then Mark's and then an unknown number that I know belongs to the church office, because I have it saved as do not answer when they remember I exist, and I stood over the sink and let it ring until the noise stopped. And then I opened a new draft that was not for the treasurer or the church or my mother. It was for a person my father absolutely did not want to hear from. A person who had once asked him for documentation he never provided, and who had the authority to ask again with less patience. And I typed their name and paused, because sending that note would not just shake him, it would change the ground under all of us, and if I was going to press send I needed to be certain I was ready for the house to tilt. There is something about getting a reaction from my father that does not involve him raising his voice or delivering one of those half lectures disguised as business advice that makes me pay attention. Because he is a man who treats control like oxygen and keeps it flowing in every conversation, so when that control slips, even a little, it is never by accident. And the fact that he had gone quiet after the governance meeting told me that the first crack had formed exactly where I wanted it to. I am not talking about a collapse or a screaming match or him calling me up to demand answers. I am talking about the kind of silence where you know a person is working hard to regain ground without revealing how much they have lost. And that silence is more telling than any performance he could put on. Mark kept circling back to me in texts, the tone shifting from curiosity to mild frustration to that forced calm people use when they are trying not to take sides. He said he did not understand why Dad was acting like there was some kind of crisis, especially because the public face of everything looked fine, and he asked if I knew more than I was saying. I told him, truthfully but selectively, that I thought there might have been some questions raised about the way certain things had been documented. Nothing criminal, nothing scandalous in the tabloid sense, but enough to make Dad feel like his competence was being second-guessed. I knew Mark's loyalty to Dad was not based on shared values so much as shared benefits, and I also knew that planting the idea of second-guessing would stick in his head in a way that would slowly erode that loyalty without me needing to tell him outright to doubt the man. The part most people never see about this kind of family dynamic is that it is not built on huge dramatic betrayals, but on years of tiny choices that stack like bricks, and once you stop contributing bricks, the wall starts to lean without anyone realizing why. I stopped putting my bricks in years ago, but I kept showing up, which meant nobody noticed the structural change until now. And this time, I had no intention of patching the wall for them. I also knew that Dad was now trying to identify the source of the governance question without being able to ask directly, because to ask would be to admit there was a question worth asking. So every conversation he had in the next few days would be shaped by suspicion and self-protection. That was the environment I needed before I made my next move, because in families like ours, confrontation does not work, it just gets absorbed into the narrative of overreaction, but doubt, when placed in the right spot, spreads like ink in water and colors everything it touches. This was when I reached out to someone I had been careful to keep in the background until now, a former board member named Alan, who had stepped down 2 years earlier after clashing with Dad over strategic priorities, which was the polite way of saying he thought Dad was more interested in the optics of generosity than in the actual impact of the programs. Alan had once told me, in a side conversation at a fundraising dinner, that I had the one skill your father fears, which, according to him, was the ability to play the long game without announcing that you were playing. I sent him a short email, 3 sentences, no commentary, with a link to the public donor list and a screenshot of a thank you note I had received that was dated outside the reported quarter. I didn't even have to tell him what to do with it. He would know exactly who to share it with and exactly how to phrase it so that it sounded like an innocent inquiry rather than an accusation. At the same time, I maintained a perfectly normal front with my mother, answering her texts about the weather, about a neighbor's daughter getting engaged, about whether I had found a new recipe for the brunch casserole she liked. I even told her I would come by later in the week to drop off a book she wanted, because it is much easier to dismantle a structure when you are inside it, smiling, acting like nothing is different. If she suspected anything, she did not say so, though there was a pause in one of our calls when she mentioned that Dad was preoccupied and avoiding certain topics, which I let sit without comment, because sometimes silence is the loudest response you can give. 2 days later, Mark called instead of texting, which he almost never does unless he wants something explained in real time. He said Dad had been on edge, checking his phone constantly, and had even snapped at one of his oldest friends during lunch. Mark sounded almost amused when he told me that Dad had asked him if he'd heard any chatter about the foundation or the scholarship program, and when Mark said no, Dad just grunted and changed the subject. That was the confirmation I needed. The second crack had opened, and it wasn't from me hitting the wall harder, it was from the pressure inside. I told Mark that Dad probably just needed a win right now, that maybe things at the board level were not going as smoothly as he liked, and that it might be best to just give him space. Mark agreed, and that was when I knew I had him exactly where I needed him, aligned with me in giving Dad space, which meant less immediate reinforcement for whatever narrative Dad was trying to build to explain his tension. The real turning point came later that night when I got a brief email from Alan. He didn't write much, just, "Your timing is perfect. Let's talk soon." That was all I needed to know that the seed had been planted in a garden where it would grow without me tending it directly. I did not go to sleep thinking about revenge in the traditional sense. I went to sleep thinking about balance, about how many years I had spent being careful not to upset the uneven ground we all stood on, and how, now that it was shifting under their feet, I did not feel guilty, not even a little. If anything, I felt sharper, clearer, as if the silence from my father and the cautious curiosity from my brother were proof that they were finally experiencing, in some small measure, what it felt like to navigate the family without being the favored one. And I will tell you this, once you have seen that look on someone's face, The one where they realize the script they've been reading from no longer matches the scene they are in. It becomes very hard to go back to pretending you are still the supporting act. The next move, I knew, would decide everything. And I already knew exactly what it was going to be. There is a moment in every long game where you realize you do not need more evidence or more outrage or more pep talks in the mirror. You just need the one clean move that cannot be walked back. And for me, that moment arrived on a weekday morning when my phone was full of polite chaos from people who always sound helpful until you ask them to put their help in writing. And I understood that if I kept nudging and hinting and forwarding little things to the right desks, I would end up managing their discomfort instead of resolving the imbalance that has run through my family like an unspoken rule. So I opened a blank email and promised myself I would use no adjectives, no drama, no as you knows. Just facts and attachments, and the kind of clarity that forces the reader to act. I addressed it to the treasurer and the compliance officer I had worked with before, and I copied the chair of the scholarship committee because her whole reputation is built on being a straight shooter. And this was the part that made my hands go still over the keyboard. I added the address of the state office that oversees charitable reporting, not as a complaint or a grievance, but as a request for guidance on best practices, which every adult in that chain would understand as a bright light being turned on in a room that had gotten a little too comfortable with shadows, and I kept my tone so steady it almost bored me, because neutrality is a better blade than anger when you want the cut to be precise. I wrote that I was reconciling a thank you note for an in-kind training I had provided with the public donor acknowledgement for the same period and was unable to match the dates, that I had attached both documents for review, and that I would appreciate clarification on whether in-kind contributions were being recognized at fair market value in the quarter provided or deferred for presentation purposes. And I said I was copying the oversight office to make sure I had the correct framework in mind, which is bureaucratic code for please behave like there are eyes in the room, and then I attached the clean, small set of files that told the story better than I could, and I paused long enough to ask myself the only question that matters in a family like mine, which is whether I wanted relief or change, and when I answered change, I hit send. The thing about sending an email like that is the room does not explode, it inhales, which is somehow louder. And you feel it through the screen as a series of timestamps and read receipts and careful replies that try to keep the temperature down while the thermostat is already locked, and within an hour I had 3 messages. One from the compliance officer saying thank you for flagging and that he would review the attachments. One from the treasurer with a sudden request for a quick call to understand context, and one from the committee chair that was only 2 lines long but said everything because it read, "Appreciate the precision. We will handle the follow-up internally," which is the elegant way a competent woman says we are not going to pretend we did not see this. I did not answer the call. I wrote back with times I was available later in the week and reiterated that my only aim was to align records, and then I put the phone face down and let the quiet do the work. Because if you have ever spent years being told to keep the peace, you learn that sometimes peace is just another word for the person with less power carrying more of the load, and I was setting that load down in a place where other people would have to pick it up. Predictably, my mother texted with small talk and then slipped in the real question, which was whether I had heard that there were confusing emails going around and whether I could help smooth things out. And I told her the truth in a sentence that felt like a tiny act of mercy and a tiny act of rebellion at the same time, which was that smoothing things out is exactly what got us here, and that clarity is not cruelty, and I left it there. Because I was not going to let a lifetime of managing feelings swallow a moment that required standards. By late afternoon, the email had done what it was supposed to do, which was to move the center of gravity out of my father's hands and into a process that would not care about his charm or his speeches. There was a reply all from the oversight office asking for a brief set of confirmations about recognition policies and board review, and there was a calendar hold for a compliance discussion that included names I recognized from annual reports, the kind of names that sent my father into performance mode. And there was a separate message to me, quietly thanking me for taking documentation seriously, which I read without smiling because I did not do this for compliments. I did it to create a record that would stand even if everyone decided later to pretend they had never seen it. Mark called that evening with the energy of a man who is trying to be on the winning team without understanding the sport, and he said Dad was furious in that icy way of his and had made a comment about busybody auditors and people who do not appreciate what it takes to build something, and then he asked me if I knew anything about it, and I told him I had asked a routine question about documentation and that any organization worth its salt should be happy to answer. And he went quiet, and I could hear him thinking through which part of the family myth required defending, and I let him sit in that because coddling him would have been another round of the old game where I volunteer to be the reasonable one so everybody else can keep their illusions. The revenge, if you even want to call it that, was not the email itself. It was the way the email made my father answer to a standard he has used like a shield against other people for years. The way it took the conversation out of his hands and put it in a place where his voice was just one among many, and watching that happen in real time felt like stepping out of a fog I did not realize had been keeping me small, and I will admit, because I owe you honesty, that it felt good, not in a cruel way, but in the way it feels good to stop carrying something heavy you were never meant to lift by yourself. Right before I went to sleep, I opened one more draft and typed a single line to a person I had promised myself I would never pull into this unless there was no other choice, a person whose job title makes even confident men measure their words. And I read the line twice, because sending it would turn a hard day into an irreversible week, and then I hovered over send and thought, if I press this, there is no walking it back, and then my phone lit up with a new text from Mark that said Dad just asked me if you are trying to hurt him. What should I say? And I looked at the blinking cursor and the unsent line on my screen and realized I was about to decide not just how this ends for him, but how it ends for me, and I pressed send anyway. I woke up the next morning with that heavy stillness that usually means you have crossed a line you used to circle for years. And I knew before I checked my phone that the one sentence I sent to the person with real authority had already started moving through hallways where my father's charm has never meant much, because when someone whose job is to ask for receipts receives a clean, concise question with attachments that line up, they do not gossip and they do not posture. They do what they are paid to do, and they do it in writing, and that alone shifts the ground more than any family argument ever could. What I had sent, and I have to be exact because this part matters, was a formal request for clarification to the state's Charitable Oversight Council with the board chair and the compliance officer copied. And in that note I referenced the donor acknowledgement discrepancy, the in-kind valuation language, and the board minutes where recognition policies were summarized without the supporting schedule. And I asked whether our interpretation aligned with the guidance they had published last spring, which any adult reading would understand as please compare their practice to your standard. And within a few hours I had a courteous reply that thanked me for the materials and asked the organization to provide a short written response on recognition timing and review procedures, which is the bureaucratic version of saying we see the seam. Open it cleanly and show us the stitching. I did not celebrate, because this was not a victory lap kind of plan. This was a weight shift, and I stayed very boring on purpose. I answered a couple of simple follow-ups with short confirmations. I sent Mark a neutral text about being tied up at work, and I declined my mother's invitation to come by with a polite excuse that did not invite negotiation, and I kept my eye on the place where appearance becomes risk, because that is where my father always buckles first, not from guilt, not from shame, but from the realization that other people can now see what he was sure he could stage manage away. By late afternoon, I saw the tell that told me the plan had worked better than I hoped, because the board chair sent a message to the full committee announcing the engagement of an outside accounting firm to conduct an expedited review of donor recognition and in-kind contribution reporting, and she thanked the community member who brought helpful documentation to our attention, which was the first time in my life any sentence connected to my family's public face had acknowledged that I existed and that my work had weight, and I read it once and then again, and I let my hands go still, because sometimes recognition lands like a door unlocking in a house where you have been living on the wrong side of a hallway. Here is the part that will sound petty until you have lived it. I could have stopped there and called it enough, but I wanted something else, not revenge for the sake of pain, not a gotcha moment that would fade in a week. I wanted a small Clean proof that the story my father tells about merit and standards applied to him too, so I opened a new email and forwarded a single message from a few years back, the one where he wrote to me and a couple of his friends about a public event and referred to my career as nice side work, while calling my brother's business real achievement, and I sent it to exactly 4 people: the board chair, the compliance officer, the outside accountant's lead partner, and the pastor's assistant who quietly keeps the trains running. And I wrote one line above it that said, "For context on why I am careful about documentation," and then I hit send and closed the laptop because I knew what would happen next without needing to see it. I knew that the hypocrisy would now be pinned to the wall in a way that did not require me to explain myself in rooms that prefer me silent. The fallout, which I will describe without dressing it up, arrived in 3 waves that evening. First, a short message from the chair saying she appreciated the transparency and would keep my note confidential while reminding everyone of our commitment to respectful conduct. Second, a clipped text from my father that said we needed to talk about what you have done, followed by another that said, "This is not how family behaves," which made me laugh out loud in a way that surprised me, because there was nothing left in me that wanted to argue about definitions with a man who only uses the word family when it protects him. Third, a long pause, and then Mark calling with that careful voice he uses when he is trying not to sound scared, asking me if I had sent something to the board because Dad had been asked to recuse himself from certain decisions until the review was complete, and I told him the truth in a way that neither bragged nor apologized, that I had asked standard questions and provided documentation, and that I would keep doing that because it is how grown-ups fix things. He took that in with a silence that stretched, and then he said something that almost made me soften. He said he felt like he had been standing on a moving walkway and had just stepped off into regular ground, and it felt weird. And I told him that was how real accountability feels at first, like balance is a punishment, and I said if he wanted a script for what to tell Dad, he could use mine, which was that nobody is trying to hurt him. But there are rules and he knows them because he has quoted them at other people his whole life, and he said okay in a small voice, and I left it there, because rescuing him from the discomfort would have put me right back in the role I spent years trying to retire. The final move, the one I planned but did not know if I would take until everything aligned, slid into place the next morning when the outside accountant asked whether there was a conflict-free contact who could serve as a temporary point person for volunteer training records while they conducted the review. And I said yes and offered to compile the materials I had for the narrow slice I had been involved in, and they accepted without fuss, and with that one email I stepped quietly into the space my father thought he owned by default, not because I wanted a title, not because I wanted applause, but because being useful is better than being invisible when usefulness is finally respected, and I did it with a condition stated plainly in writing: that any public acknowledgement be purely about process and not about family names or personal credit, which was both a boundary and a message that I was not here to be anyone's prop. My father has not called me since, and I cannot tell you that this ended in a group hug, because it did not, but what I can tell you is that at the next board note, his name appeared under a sentence about recusal in a tone so neutral it was almost tender. And the policies were updated with language I had suggested years ago and had been ignored, and the Oversight Office closed the loop with a neat message that said the organization was cooperating fully and that the documentation would be improved going forward, and in that sequence of small, unfussy lines I felt the thing I had been chasing for longer than I want to admit, which was not revenge exactly, but equilibrium. And the knowledge that if he ever stands up again to deliver one of those speeches into a room full of people who clap on command, at least a few of them will hear a different soundtrack than the one he thinks he is conducting. Later that night, Mark sent a short text that said Dad is quiet and weird and I think he is scared of saying the wrong thing, what happened, and I stared at it and understood that we had reached the end of the part that needed telling. So I wrote back that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stop carrying someone else's version of you, and I put down the phone and made myself a cup of coffee, not as a prop and not as a shield, but as a small, ordinary choice on a night when I did not need to brace for a speech, and I sat there feeling something close to calm, not because I had punished anyone, but because I had finally turned a story that used to run me into a story I run, and that is all the triumph I needed.